Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, I'm going to get right into my subject. So much is happening in Gaza with Israel and the outbreak of demonstrations throughout the country and in other countries that I'm going to read because it will hold me more to the topic and I won't stray as far afield. So I'm going to get right into it. And this is dated March 9th of this year. It was in the Omaha World Herald. Unless I say otherwise, all of these were in the World Herald. And if it came from another paper, they would make note of it. Some children in Gaza are dying of hunger. Rafah, Gaza Strip. It's not just Israeli bombs that have killed children in war-ravaged Gaza. Some are now dying of hunger. Officials have warned for months that Israel's siege and offensive were pushing the Palestinian territory into famine. Hunger is most acute in northern Gaza, which has been isolated by Israeli forces and has suffered long cutoffs of food supplies. At least 20 people have died from malnutrition and dehydration at the North's Kamal, Adwan, and Shifa hospitals. That's according to the health ministry. Most of the dead are children, including one as old as 15, as well as a 72-year-old man. Particularly vulnerable children are also beginning to succumb in the south. I have a sock here right quick. Think of this as Gaza, and the bombing and the siege from Israel started up here at the top. They told the people to move because they were going to be attacking, airplanes and so forth. So the people started moving southward, down. And when they got to this point, they were told that they had to move again. Some tried to go back north, but they were not able to. They stopped. So they continued to be pushed. And finally, to make a long story short, they wound up down here in the toe, which is Rafah. And there are over 1 million people in that area. So keep in mind the sock idea and the people being driven southward by Israeli forces. Continuing. At the Emirati hospital in Rafah, 16 premature babies died of malnutrition-related causes over the past 5 weeks, one of the senior doctors said. The child deaths we feared are here, Adeli Kaur, UNICEF's Middle East chief, said in a statement. Israel's bombardment and ground assaults have already wreaked a high toll among children, who, along with women, make up nearly 3/4 of the more than 30,800 Palestinians killed, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Malnutrition is generally slow to bring death, striking children and the elderly first. Other factors can play a role. Underfed mothers have difficulty breastfeeding children. Diarrheal diseases rampant in Gaza due to lack of clean water and sanitation leave many unable to retain any of the calories they ingest, said a UNICEF official who is a child nutrition expert. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, sometimes leading to death from other diseases. The siege. Israel largely shut off entry of food, water, medicine, and other supplies after launching its assault on Gaza after Hamas's October 7th attack on southern Israel. The fighting killed about 1,200 people, and Palestinian militants took about 250 hostages. It has allowed this is kind of botched. Distribution within Gaza has been crippled. UN officials say convoys are regularly turned back by Israeli forces. The military often refuses safe passage amid the fighting, and aid is snatched off trucks by hungry Palestinians en route to drop-off points. Conditions in the north, largely under Israeli control for months, have become desperate. Entire districts of Gaza City and surrounding areas have been reduced to rubble by Israeli forces. Still, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians remain. Meat, milk, vegetables, and fruit are nearly impossible to find. That's according to several residents who spoke to the Associated Press. The few items in shops are random and sold at hugely inflated prices, mainly nuts, snacks, and spices. Most people eat a weed that crops up in empty lots known as kabiza. Fatima, that's the name of the weed. Fatima Shaheen, a 70-year-old who lives with her 2 sons and their children in northern Gaza, said this boiled weed is her main meal, and her family has also ground up food meant for rabbits to use as flour. Quote, "We are dying for a piece of bread," she said. Dr. Hussan Abu Safaya, the acting head of Kamal Adwan Hospital, told the Associated Press his staff treats 300 to 400 children a day, and that 75% of them are suffering from malnutrition. Recent airdrops of aid by the U.S. and other countries provide far lower amounts of aid than truck deliveries, which have become rare and somewhat dangerous. UNRWA, that's this UN outfit, says Israeli authorities have not allowed it to deliver supplies to the north since January 23rd. The World Food Organization, which had paused deliveries because of safety concerns, said the military forced its first convoy to the north in 2 weeks to turn back Tuesday. When the Israeli military organized a food delivery to Gaza City last week, troops guarding the convoy opened fire as thousands of hungry Palestinians mobbed the trucks. Some 120 people were killed in the shooting, as well as by being trampled in the chaos. At Emirati Hospital, Dr. Ahmad Al-Shir, deputy head of the nursery unit, said the recent deaths of premature babies was rooted in malnutrition among mothers. Malnourishment and extreme stress are both factors causing premature underweight births, and doctors say anecdotally, cases have risen during the war, though the UN does not have the statistics. Remember, if you watch the news, the newscaster reads all through the program, looks up occasionally. Al-Shir said premature babies are treated for several days to improve their weight, but then they are released home, which is often a tent with not enough heat, with mothers too malnourished to breastfeed and milk difficult to obtain. Parents sometimes give newborns plain water instead, which is oftentimes causing diarrhea. Within days, the babies are brought back to us in a terrible state. Some were brought already dead, Al-Shir said. He said 14 babies at the hospital died in February and 2 more so far in March. Currently, the hospital's wards have 44 babies under 10 days old with weights as low as 4 pounds, some on life support. Every incubator has at least 3 premature babies in it, raising the risk of infection. Al-Shir said he fears some will meet the same fate when returned home. Quote, "We treat them now but God knows what the future will be, he said. This article, May 9th, Biden warns Israel, U.S. aid at risk. President Joe Biden issued a stark warning to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Thursday that future U.S. support for Israel's Gaza war depends on the swift implementation of new steps to protect civilians and aid workers. Biden and Netanyahu's roughly 30-minute call just days after Israeli airstrikes killed 7 food aid workers in Gaza added a new layer of complication to the leaders' increasing strained relationship. Biden's message marked a sharp change in his administration's steadfast support for Israel's war efforts, with the U.S. leader for the first time threatening to rethink his backing if Israel does not change its tactics and allow much more humanitarian aid into Gaza. The White House would not specify what could change about U.S. policy, but it could include altering military sales to Israel and America's diplomatic backup on the world stage. Netanyahu's office said earlier today that his security cabinet approved a series of, quote, immediate steps, unquote, to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza, including the reopening of a key crossing that was destroyed October 7th. Biden, quote, made clear the need for Israel to announce and implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers, unquote, the White House said following the 30-minute call. Quote, he made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps, unquote. Biden also told Netanyahu that an, quote, immediate ceasefire is essential and urged Israel to reach such an accord without delay, unquote. That's according to the White House, which described the conversation as direct and honest. Netanyahu's office said the Erez crossing, which for years served as the only passenger terminal for people to move in and out of Gaza, would be temporarily reopened. White House National Security Council spokesperson Andrea Watson welcomed those moves, adding, quote, as the president said today on the call, U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these and other steps, including steps to protect innocent civilians and the safety of aid workers, Watson said. The leaders' conversation came as the World Central Kitchen, founded by restaurateur Jose Andres to provide food relief to disaster-stricken areas, called for an independent investigation into the Israeli strikes that killed 7 of the group's staff members, including an American citizen. Israel acknowledged responsibility for the strike on the World Central Kitchen workers, but said the convoy was not targeted and their deaths were not intentional. The country continues to investigate. The White House said the U.S. had no plans to conduct its own investigation. Separately, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, I don't know if they call him Blinken because that's what he does with his eyes, but anyway, Secretary of State Antony Blinken told reporters in Brussels that U.S. support would be curtailed if Israel does not make significant adjustments to how it's carrying out the war against Hamas. While House National Security spokesman John Kirby echoed the call for tangible and concrete changes to be taken by the Israelis beyond reiterating long-stated calls for allowing additional aid to get into Gaza. Quote, if there's no changes to their policy, in their approaches, then there's going to have to be changes to ours, Kirby said. Quote, there are things that need to be done. There are too many civilians being killed, unquote. Biden also renewed his concerns about Netanyahu's plan to carry out an operation in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, where about 1.5 million displaced Palestinians are sheltering. Rafah, down here in the toe of the stocking, 1,500,000 people that have been pushed down from the north by Israeli bombs, artillery, and other heavy weaponry. Still, the Biden administration has proceeded with arms transfers and deliveries to Israel, many of which were approved years ago. So, as they say, talk is cheap. It takes money to buy land. This May 10th, Netanyahu disregards threat to halt weapons. These people show to his face, Biden, how little they think of him. He can say what he pleases, but they're going to do what they please, and Biden will always fold or knuckle under. Israeli military already has the arms it needs for Rafah, an Israeli official says. From the Associated Press, Jerusalem, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Thursday that a U.S. threat to withhold some arms would not prevent Israel from continuing its offensive in Gaza, indicating it might proceed with an invasion of the packed city of Rafah against the wishes of its closest ally, the United States. In other words, as long as the United States goes along and lets that Israeli tail wag that big American dog, then things are fine, or as white people used to say when I was in high school, hunky-dory. But when Biden says change up and Netanyahu doesn't want to, he tells Biden in diplomatic language where he can go. Continuing, President Joe Biden has urged Israel not to go ahead with such an operation over fears it would exacerbate the humanitarian catastrophe in the Palestinian enclave. On Wednesday, he said the United States would not provide weapons for a Rafah offensive, raising pressure on Netanyahu. The U.S. also warned Thursday that Israel would deal a strategic win to Hamas if it carries out plans for the all-out assault on Rafah. But in a statement Thursday, Netanyahu said, quote, if we have to stand alone, we will stand alone. If we need to, we will fight with our fingernails. But we have much more than fingernails, unquote. And it had come from the United States of America. Israel's top military spokesman, Rear Admiral, and that's a real term in the military term, Rear Admiral. It's not saying he is the rear. You know what I'm getting at? Anatomically speaking. Israel's top military spokesman, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, also appeared to downplay the effect of any arms holdup. Quote, the Army has munitions for the missions it plans and for the missions in Rafah too. We have what we need, unquote, he said in response to a question at a press conference. Israel has repeatedly threatened to invade Rafah, where about 1,300,000 Palestinians, more than half of Gaza's population, took refuge. And what was happening when Israel would warn the people in the north that there was going to be action, so move southward? When the people wound up where they were told to move, there were attacks there, and hundreds of Palestinians were killed in the place where Israel told them to go. Israel was like a butcher. Rafah and all of the Gaza Strip are like a slaughterhouse. Let me continue. Israel has repeatedly threatened to invade Rafah, where about 1,300,000 Palestinians, more than half of Gaza's population, took refuge. The city in southern Gaza is the main hub for humanitarian operations, which were severely hindered by the closure of Gaza's two main crossings this week. Israel claims Rafah is the last stronghold of Hamas and says the army must go in if it hopes to dismantle the militant group. When you've got 1,300,000 people clustered here, being told to move from up here by Israel to move down here, and now there they are, and Israel is going to use airplanes to drop bombs, they're going to use artillery, and they're going to use tanks. You could not spit without it landing on a human being. But obviously, the Israelis don't consider the Palestinians to be human beings. Continuing. In an earlier response to Biden's decision, Israel's far-right national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, wrote a post on social media with a heart between the words Hamas and Biden. Here's a heart and Hamas. And that heart connects Biden and Hamas. Such contempt shown for the United States of America, the Colossus of the North. Continuing. He and other ultranationalist members of Netanyahu's coalition support a large-scale Rafah operation and threaten to bring down Netanyahu's government if it doesn't happen. Quote, "Our view is any kind of major Rafah ground operation would be actually strengthening Hamas's hands at the negotiating table, not Israel's," White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said Thursday. He said more civilian deaths from an Israeli offensive would give more ammunition to Hamas's twisted narrative about Israel. Aid groups say a Rafah invasion would be catastrophic. The UN says that most of Gaza's 2,300,000 Palestinians suffer from hunger and that northern Gaza is already experiencing, quote, full-blown famine, unquote. And this is at the hands of, quote, God's chosen people. Chosen for what? To do the work of Satan? Well, if that's it, they're certainly carrying it out effectively. Continuing. Even the limited operation Israel launched earlier this week, in which a tank brigade captured the Gaza side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, threw humanitarian operations into crisis. CIA Director Bill Burns and other delegations to the talks left Egypt without a deal Thursday. Kirby said it was too soon to know whether the aid holdup altered the Israeli calculus, but the U.S. was advising Israel on how it could defeat Hamas through more surgical operations. Some analysts said the rift between Biden and Netanyahu threatened to weaken Israel's negotiating position and harden Hamas's stances. Hamas demanded guarantees for an end to the war and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza as a part of any deal, steps Israel ruled out. Quote, "It sends a discordant message at a time when Hamas is holding out on a hostage deal in the hopes that pressure will grow on Israel and it will gain a ceasefire without having to give anything in return, unquote, said Israel Policy Forum, a pro-Israel organization based in New York. Now they're getting advice from New York on how to destroy the Palestinians, but nobody is criticizing that while criticizing students for protesting the viciousness of Israel against the Palestinians when they protest on and around university campuses. But it shows the power that the Jews have in this country. And remember, that is not every Jew. It's a collective word because they describe themselves collectively and they act collectively. So those who behave in this fashion get the label and deserve it. But if you walk with those who are lame, you yourself will learn to limp. And when you have all the outward signs, you are deemed by those who are observing to be one of those with whom you are associating, with whom you share all of these signs and characteristics. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, known as UNRWA, said it only has enough stocks to maintain operations for a few days, and it began rationing. This is happening now. This is dated May 11th. The Biden administration said Friday that Israel's use of U.S.-provided weapons in Gaza likely violated international humanitarian law, but wartime conditions prevented U.S. officials from determining that for certain in specific airstrikes. And the headline of this, White House, Israel likely violated international law. The administration's finding of reasonable evidence to conclude that its ally breached international law in its conduct of the war in Gaza, released in a summary of a report being delivered to Congress on Friday, represents the strongest such statement from Biden officials. Its caveat that it was unable immediately to link specific U.S. weapons to individual strikes by Israeli forces in Gaza, however, could give the administration leeway in any future decision on whether to restrict U.S. provisions of offensive weapons to Israel. The administration's findings, a first-of-its-kind assessment that was compelled by President Joe Biden's fellow Democrats in Congress, came after 7 months of airstrikes, ground fighting, aid restrictions that so far claimed the lives of almost 35,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children. Suppose that Hamas killed 35,000 Jews, most of whom were women and children. Would the world be in an uproar? Palestinians are deemed subhuman, obviously, and the Jews are treating them in a way that they would be criticized for if they did it to beasts of burden, or if they slaughtered beasts for meat and did it in this fashion, they would be roundly condemned. So they deem the Palestinians to be subhumans, or the Untermenschen, which the Nazis referred to the Jews as being when they were gassing them, burning them, and shooting them. Biden has tried to walk an ever finer line in his support of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war against Hamas. He faces growing rancor at home and abroad over the soaring Palestinian death toll and the onset of famine, caused in large part by Israeli restrictions on the movement of food and aid into Gaza. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly voted by a wide margin Friday to grant new, quotes, rights and privileges, unquote, to Palestine, and called on the Security Council to reconsider Palestine's request to become the 194th member of the United Nations. What people don't realize is that those Jews who came to Palestine were not indigenous people. They were kicked out of Europe. They were kicked out of every country in Europe where they went. Spain, Portugal, you name the country, and they were kicked out. They wound up going to South Africa and joining the white South Africans in oppressing the indigenous black population. When we talk about apartheid in South Africa, how vicious it was, the Jews were right there underwriting it, undergirding it. They had an official tie-in with the racist South African government. Black people need to know that. The Jews did not have a state in Palestine. They went to Palestine in the way that Europeans came to this country and stole the land from the indigenous people. And this rhyme, as I mentioned it to you all, if you remember it, was said about the Japanese degrading them, but it applies to what the Jews did when they came to Palestine. Jews were not in Palestine. Palestinians were there. That's why it was called Palestine. How courteous the Japanese. He always say, "Excuse it, please." Walk into his neighbor's garden, smile, and says, "I beg your pardon." Then he grins his friendly grin, invites his hungry family in, and then he bows his friendly bow. "So sorry, this my garden now." That's what the Jews did when they went to Palestine. And they, in 1948, I'm not going to tell you what happened in 1948, but it was critical. A Jewish state did not exist. It's an artificial contrivance, a concoction that was built on the stolen land of the Palestinians. And just as in this country, the native people were placed on reservations and treated like subhumans. That was the model the Jews applied in Palestine to the Palestinians. And they maintained contact with South Africa. And the United Nations officially identified Zionism, which is going to Palestine, Zionism as racism. Malcolm X said, "History is the study best suited to reward our efforts." We should read. We need to understand. And when you see these students who are not doing on these campuses anything near to what the Jews are doing to the Palestinians, mainly women and children, yet the police are summoned. They're using these exploding grenades. They're using clubs. They're arresting. They're hog-tying students for exercising what they thought was their right to freedom of speech. But the Jews have a lot of power in this country, and they can counter-demonstrate, and nothing is done to them. There will come a day of reckoning. Let me see if I can find my place. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly voted by a wide margin Friday to grant new, quote, rights and privileges, unquote, to Palestine, and called on the Security Council to reconsider Palestine's request to become the 194th member of the United Nations. This article I'm reading from was May 11th. This is going on now. The world body approved the Arab and Palestinian-sponsored resolution by a vote of 143 to 9 with 25 abstentions. The United States, lapdog that it is, lackey running dog, the United States voted against it along with Israel, Argentina, Czechia, Hungary, Micronesia, Nauru, wherever that is, Palau, wherever that is, and Papua New Guinea. You see the kind of places who have a seat at the table in the UN, but not the Palestinians. The vote reflected the wide global support for full membership of Palestine in the United Nations, with many countries expressing outrage at the escalating death toll in Gaza and fears of a major Israeli offensive in Rafah. I don't use this kind of language. Hell is not a profane word, but it can be used as profanity.
You've been watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to leave suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This is an EWC Communications production.